Hello friends and welcome back to Exit Your Matrix. Brad Villers here. On we go, peeling back another layer of The Most Dangerous Superstition by Larkin Rose. And I thought I'd start off by offering some additional information in support of my overwhelming praise for this book, and that is its Amazon rating of 4.6 stars with over 1,100 reviews. And hopefully I'm doing a decent job summarizing it, but I know you would gain so much more by reading it, so I would encourage you to purchase it for yourself. So let's ease into this discussion today with a question, something gentle and non-confrontational. Is the belief in government indistinguishable from a cult? Wait, now before you swipe and rid yourself of such heresy, allow me to unpack that a bit. Is it not true that while most people believe government is necessary, they also recognize, quite vitriolically in many cases, that the very same government is often oppressive, corrupt, abusive, unfair, and most certain inefficient? So would it not stand to reason that this contradiction, this irrationality, I hope we can all agree we see and often devote a great deal of criticism to, could fairly be described as reverential devotion to this concept we call government? With that devotion perhaps even taking on the form of religious worship? Are those terms too strong, or do they accurately describe precisely what's going on here? And by that I mean one very important ingredient which is needed, and that is faith. And specifically the form of faith that comes about when we marry this thing we call government with what we always want to believe is our ability to reform it, to control it, to guide it, through our political activity and our voting and our letters to our so-called representatives, and on and on. In short, Rose tells us authority does not and cannot exist at all, and, as an extension, government does not exist. Oh sure, what we refer to as government certainly has buildings and paid enforcers and guns, but it's at this point the author introduces a simply brilliant analogy to help clear away the mental clutter. And he does it with this, quote, "The entire debate about how authority should be used and what government should do is exactly as useful as debating how Santa Claus should handle Christmas." Burn. If we're honest enough with ourselves to learn from the very clear and documented history that roads came into being, children were educated, people created livelihoods, fed themselves, obtained shelter, raised families, and furthered their and their neighbors' interests long before government grew beyond its initial stated purpose of simply securing its inhabitants' ability to pursue those interests, and became the behemoth that it is, it becomes quite apparent that, to use the analogy, Christmas happens like clockwork, but does so without a belief in Santa Claus. He sums it up this way: the problem with popular misconceptions is just that. They are popular. When any belief, even the most ridiculous, illogical belief, is held by most people, it will not feel unreasonable to the believers. Continuing in the belief will feel easy and safe, while questioning it will feel uncomfortable and very difficult, if not impossible. Rose then moves on to the topic of laws, which he defines as authoritarian commands backed by the threat of retaliation. And he offers this, quote, "Of course, using the term law to describe the inherent properties of the universe, such as the laws of physics and mathematics, has nothing to do with the concept of authority. Furthermore, there is another concept called natural law, which is very different from statutory law, i.e. legislation. The concept of natural law is that there are standards of right and wrong intrinsic to humanity that do not depend upon any human authority, and that in fact supersede all human authority." Here we have come upon nothing short of a monumental topic, one he describes as the subject of many discussions in the not-too-distant past, but rare to hear uttered by Americans, or anyone for that matter, today. Natural law is a subject I've devoted considerable time to and is a cornerstone of the knowledge I've committed to share. And I'll be putting together another one of my Some Thoughts On videos on this subject where I'll go into it in more detail, but let me briefly introduce you to one of the most important voices on the topic of natural law. Here is Mark Passio of What on Earth is Happening, giving his definition of natural law.
I tell people who want the 6 o'clock news edition of what natural law is, okay? Natural law is universal, non-man-made, binding, and immutable conditions that govern the consequences of behavior, and specifically, at least on this planet, human behavior. I would say in the universe, it governs the behavior of all intelligent beings. Intelligent beings. Okay? Natural law is a body of universal spiritual laws which act as the governing dynamics of consciousness.
So statutes or legislation or authoritarian laws or whatever you care to call them are simply the whims of a particular person or group at a particular place and at a particular time, which have been reduced to writing, having nothing in common, as you can well see, with the laws of creation which comprise natural law. Thus, authoritarian laws, man's laws, are either contrary to natural law and consequently immoral and unjust, or consistent with natural law and, as a result, redundant and completely unnecessary. Next, Rose takes us to the subject of mythologies. First, the ludicrous myth that government in any way involves consent, and as we've been so carefully conditioned to believe, the, quote, consent of the governed. He quickly dispels this myth through the simple examination of language, with consent being the voluntary and willing participation of two or more parties, while governing meaning one party controlling another. So the concept of the consent of the governed is a complete contradiction. He elaborates by pointing out that no individual or group can give consent for something to be done to some other person or group, and drives the point home with this, quote, "It defies logic to say, I give my consent for you to be robbed." He goes on, quote, "But in reality, no one ever agrees to let those in government do whatever they want. So in order to fabricate consent where there is none, believers in authority add another, even more bizarre step to the mythology, the notion of implied consent. The claim is that, by living in a particular location, we acquiesce to the rules, in the form of those laws I mentioned, and that if we don't like them, we're free to leave. But we know, don't we, that the only time we can rightfully issue such edicts is when the property or territory involved belongs to us, when it is our property, and under such circumstances we have every right to do so." With that, Rose piles on, quote, "To tell someone that his only valid choices are either to leave the country or to abide by whatever commands the politicians issue logically implies that everything in that country is the property of the politicians. That is exactly what the implied consent theory means, that every country is a huge slave plantation, and that everything and everyone there is the property of the politicians. And of course, the master does not need the consent of his slave." And he doesn't stop there. Quote, "Not only is the theory of implied consent logically flawed, but it also obviously does not describe reality. Any government that had the consent of its subjects would not need and would not have law enforcers. Enforcement happens only if someone does not consent to something." We'll let that do it for now, but our author is by no means done, not by a long shot. As inconvenient and uncomfortable as his points may be, I'm hoping that you're starting to see, as I have, painfully, the fallacies in this idea we call authority that forms the basis for the illogical and contradictory construct we know as government. We're just getting warmed up, folks, so please join me in the next phase of our adventure in Larkin Rose's The Most Dangerous Superstition. As always, thanks for being here, and be well.